Hi guys, so as Don and Kevin mentioned earlier, I'm Tiffany. So before we get into the bulk of the presentation, I sort of just wanted to give you all a little bit of background. I'm currently a fourth year dental student at UCLA, and I actually did my undergrad at UCLA's rival school, USC, with a major in biology. So one question that I got asked a lot during the application cycle, as you guys will too, is why dentistry? And for me, it was actually just by chance. I was looking for part-time work when I was still trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And one of my friends was like, hey, you know, the office that I'm working at is looking to hire an assistant. So why don't you come and check it out? I did later that day and ended up really loving it. And a couple years later, I applied for dental school, and that's where I'm at right now. So a little bit about what my role at UCLA is. Outside of being a dental student, all of us are really big on extracurriculars because the opportunities are plentiful here. And probably one of my more substantial ones is being the fourth year admissions committee representative. And in a couple of slides, I'll sort of give you guys an overview of what that means. But after graduation, I'm doing a one-year general practice residency at UCLA. So I'm excited to hopefully see you guys around as you trickle into interview over the next couple of months. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so this is information that you can pretty much get from the UCLA website, but I did want to review it just a little bit. One of the things that I wanted to highlight was I think our committee does a really good job of wanting to really diversify the class. And one of the things that I often get asked year after year is, do we give preferential treatment to out-of-state versus in-state? Which is a fair question because every single year we tend to see the vast majority of our classmates being from California. But after 2 years on the committee, I definitely say no. In fact, we really like seeing out-of-state students. The only reason why we end up seeing more students from California year after year is just because out-of-state students have a tendency to end up wanting to stay in their home states either because of family, wanting to be closer to family, or due to finances. But we definitely want students from all walks of life, all age ranges. We have classmates that are 20, we have classmates that are 40, we have classmates that are married with kids. And in terms of our stats, it's hovered around these numbers for the last couple of years. But I have to remind you, and I cannot emphasize this enough, this is only an average. If UCLA is a school, sorry. Max, come here. Sorry, one second. If UCLA is a school that you're interested in, we highly encourage you to apply. Even if you're feeling a little bit insecure about your statistics, if you feel like it's a little bit low, I will be the first to tell you that you have some of your biggest advocates sitting on our committee. I will always fight for you. I know of at least a couple other faculty that will always fight for you as long as you're able to explain your case. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. So as long as you're interested, just apply, put your best foot forward, put together a really good application, and yeah, just hope for the best. So in terms of the admissions committee, one thing that we really like to emphasize these last couple of years is there really is a really big push from an administration to start interviewing earlier, which means reviewing these applications earlier. And what this means is a couple years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago when I was applying, UCLA was notorious for being late in the cycle. And what that meant was I probably wasn't expecting to hear back from UCLA until late September, early October for an interview invite. But that's no longer the case. So now we're probably one of the first schools in the nation to offer up interview invitations, which means it's very important if you are interested in UCLA to get your application submitted as early as possible. And I'll spend a little bit of time later on talking about what early means and what the time frame is. In terms of the panel, there is a panel of about 10 to 12 people on the admissions committee. 2 of them are always going to be students. So I'm the fourth year representative. There's also a third year representative who isn't here with us today. And then the other faculty, it's a variety of didactic faculty, meaning these are going to be the faculty that you primarily interact with in lecture. And then there's also going to be your clinical faculty. And these are the ones that you primarily interact with your third and fourth year when you transition into clinic. And the reason why it's very important for us to have all these different members from all these different divisions in the committee is because they bring their own personal accounts and histories with applicants and dental students over the years. So for instance, a didactic faculty is a little bit concerned about your GPA or your DAT. And the reasons why is because, hey, I've been sitting on this committee for the last couple of years. I've seen applicants come in with this GPA and this DAT before, and they tend to struggle in my classes, so this is a concern. Or the clinical faculty is like, hey, I've seen applicants like this in the past, and they tend to be nightmares in clinic, and we have a hard time teaching them, and this is my concern. So then they bring these concerns to the table, and then the committee's responsibility is to then review all of it and decide whether or not we want to proceed with the application, if we want to put it on hold for reconsideration later on, or if we want to just go ahead and put it into the rejection pile, okay? And another thing that I didn't quite understand at the time when I was applying was this whole thing with batches. You hear batch 1, batch 2, batch 3. What does all of this mean? For us, the term batch is really just how we label interview groups. What it means is just from the first week that we start reviewing applications, we receive applications in batches of about like 15 students or so. So the committee's job is individually, we will each review these 15 applications. We'll take a week to review them. At the end of the week, we will meet and all of us will discuss all the applications, all of our concerns, all the applications that we liked, disliked, and then we'll make the decision as to whether or not we want to proceed with interview. So that's sort of the admissions committee overview. What we see is actually very similar to what you guys can see when you download the PDF version of your application on ASDA. I don't know if that's still an option now, but I know that it was when I was applying. It's usually about like a 30-page PDF packet. Some applications are a little bit longer. Sometimes they're 40 pages. The length of it really doesn't matter. It's just whatever the applicant wants to write. I do want to reassure you that we give all applicants a very holistic review. Anything that you put on the application, we will read it because we know that you guys have put in so much effort into putting together a polished and well-written application, and you deserve to have us thoroughly assess at every single aspect of your application. So we read everything. I like to go in order in section based off of how I see the application because I like the way that it's formatted. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is the DAT and GPA, which is what I look at first when I receive the packet. I'm sure you guys have all heard already, DAT, there are different sections. Some sections are weighed a little bit more heavily than others, and for us at UCLA, that's definitely true. Some of the sections that almost never come up in discussion. One of them is QR. We see low QRs all the time, and it's almost something that's almost disregarded. If it's very low, some faculty will sort of red flag it, but for me, like, I'm always one to say, hey, like when I was taking the DAT, the QR section was such a hit or miss. Like, it really just depends, and honestly, it really doesn't matter. And then faculty will be like, oh, okay, all right, let's move on. Another one is PAT. Unless you come in with like a 14 or 15 PAT, we almost never talk about it. Reading comprehension, if students come in with like a 14 or 15, it's often discussed, but our biggest concern is whether or not this student has the ability or a command of the English language enough that when they transition into clinic, they are able to adequately communicate with the patient so that there aren't any misunderstandings. That's our biggest concern. However, when it comes to reading comprehension, there are many other ways to assess it, and an exam isn't really the way to do it, at least in my opinion. So what we usually do is we will, okay, this is an area of concern, but we use other ways to assess the applicant. So we'll look at the rest of the application. If we like them enough and want to see how they are in interview, then during the interview, we'll look at the written portion. We'll let the interviewer know, hey, this is what our concerns are. So can you please assess the applicant for this? And then the interviewer will then tell us, Were they able to communicate well? How was the conversation? Did it feel natural? Did it feel like they can't quite communicate very well? So reading comprehension is another one that's, okay. The biggest focuses should be academic average and total science, so your sciences. But I think as applicants, even when I was a predent, we had a very warped view of what an acceptable academic average was. Everyone's always like, oh my God, if it's not like a 21, 22 above, it's not good. That is absolutely not true. If like on the panel, if one faculty raises a red flag about like an academic average of 18, 2 or 3 others will be like, hey, have you seen the national average? Like that's exactly what the national average is. Like those scores are perfectly fine and good. So let's just move on. So don't be discouraged if you feel like your scores feel a little bit low. You're probably being too hard on yourself. Like just, you're fine, okay? Another thing is GPA. I get asked about that all the time. What's considered a low GPA and what's acceptable. We very much consider upward trends. I'll be the first to tell you, when I applied to UCLA, I applied with a very, very low GPA. At some point, I had a 2.86. Granted, my 4th year, I did work really hard and I raised it, but it was still like low 3s. So it's not something to get discouraged by. We consider that, you know, very often your first couple of years, you're still adjusting in undergrad. We know that it's a hard time. A lot of you have moved away from home. You're dealing with a lot emotionally too. If you're able to show us that you were able to improve over time and picked it up your 3rd or 4th year, that's great. We love seeing that. Another thing is if you had like a couple of hard quarters, if you're able to explain it in the other parts of the application that allow you to, we also take that into consideration. And then let's say your GPA was low enough that you either you decided not to apply this year, or you didn't hear back from the schools that you applied to and you have to reapply. One thing that we love to see is a post-bac program. During my predent days, I kept hearing post-bac, but I didn't quite understand what a post-bac was. Essentially, it's a 1 or 2 year program that you apply and pay for, and it focuses on core sciences and advanced sciences, and then you also take core dental classes with dental students. So if you do well in this, it shows us that you've grown since your GPA, that you can handle this curriculum, and that you can excel in dental school. So there are always ways around scores that you feel are a little bit lower than they need to be. And if you have any questions about this later, we can definitely talk about it in the Q&A. Another thing that students talk to me about all the time is you get bombarded with all these resources in undergrad, and then you have so many people giving you all this advice, and you feel like you're getting tugged in all these directions, and you don't necessarily know where you should focus your efforts. I know when I was applying, everyone told me, oh, UCLA is such a research-heavy school. You have to do research. Like, if you don't have research, don't even think about getting in. And I was like, oh, man. So I really tried to find a research position, but even though that wasn't really like what interested me. In hindsight, knowing what I know now, I wish I had focused my efforts in something that I really liked doing, like volunteering, community outreach. I would have like preferred to spend my time doing that, because research is not going to make or break you at all. Like, we've never discussed research before on the panel. Like, whether an applicant has it or not, it really doesn't matter. Our focus is mainly what we like to see is applicants that have picked a couple of things that they clearly like doing. They've put their effort, all their effort into this. And when you, let's say it's volunteering, and then when you pair that with your personal statement, your life experiences, your letters of recommendation, it paints a picture of who you are as a person that's very clear to us. Once we see all these different pieces come together, we can say, okay, this is where their passions lie. This is where their motivations are. And we really get a sense of them as an individual. We don't get that if you come in with 15 to 20 different activities, each one having 5 or 6 hours. That isn't quite as meaningful to us. So I'd really encourage you to really think about what's most meaningful to you and what you want to do, and focus your efforts on dedicating your time towards that, okay? Shadowing is probably one of the more important ones and one that comes up in discussion when we review applicants more often than not. And it usually comes down to two big mistakes that applicants tend to make. One of them is definitely not spending enough time at a general practice office. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit. The second one is a lot of dental students come in with relatives, usually their parents or siblings, that are already practicing dentists. Many of them are general practitioners. And we don't necessarily like to see students that have spent the bulk, sometimes all of their shadowing hours, at their relatives' offices. Even if it ends up being a general practice, our feeling is that the experience that you get shadowing at a relative's office is never going to be the same as if you were to go into an office that you don't know. The learning and the questions and all of that, it's just not, it just doesn't compare between the two. So it's okay if you want to shadow at these relatives' offices, but it's still encouraged that you still go out and explore other options. And cycling back a little bit to why shadowing a general practitioner is so important. We know that a lot of students have had a lot of exposures to specialties, and a lot of them come in knowing that they want to pursue a specialty, which is great, it's fine. We do not penalize them for it. Our concern is mainly whether or not you know what you're getting yourself into, because in the 4 years that you're in dental school, the 2.5 years you spend in clinic, 90% of it, you're practicing general dentistry. You can't move on to your specialty program unless you get through these 2.5 years in clinic. So we need to know that the applicants, even if they want to specialize, they know what they're getting themselves into, that they've had enough exposure to the procedures and to just general practice so that they know that they at least have a little bit of enjoyment for it, and those 2.5 years in clinic aren't going to be entirely miserable for them. Because there are, like every year or so, there's always 1 or 2 students that end up dropping out of the program because 3 years in, after they spent 3 years in dental school, they realize, you know what, this is not for me, like I'm done. That's sort of what we want to avoid going forward. So that's why we encourage general practice shadowing. Volunteering. This is something that I personally really love to see on your applications, and I know at least a couple other faculty on the panel do love to see it. And I think a big reason why is because UCLA is located near the heart of Los Angeles. Around our immediate area, there are tons of dental deserts. There are areas that are very severely underserved, which means in the greater Los Angeles area, throughout the year, there are many, many events, some of the biggest healthcare events within Southern California that are within a 15 or 20-minute drive of UCLA. And one of the things that we really pride ourselves in is that we often have the biggest turnout at these events. If you look at some of the photos on the PowerPoint, you know, the student turnout for all these events is pretty significant. So our hope is that we can find applicants that have a passion and want to do community outreach. And then once they matriculate into dental school, they'll continue to want to do community outreach and can join us and can join the faculty in helping the community at these events. One thing that I'm asked is, between dental volunteering and just volunteering in general, is one weighed more heavily than the other? And the answer is no. It's really just personal preference. Like all volunteering, we love seeing it. It's viewed favorably. The only upside of dental volunteering is if you as an applicant wanted a little bit of insight, one-on-one time with dental students and with dental faculty to sort of get an idea of what dental school is like, then this is your opportunity to get to know them. But I've seen volunteering like going to retirement homes and reading to the elderly, playing instruments for the elderly, walking dogs for the elderly. I've seen food bank volunteering. I've seen working with children. All of those things are great. Just find something that's accessible to you, and find something that you really like doing and just go for it, okay? Now moving on to the personal statement, I know Kevin and Don have a specific lecture series tackling this. So I'm just gonna sort of touch up on probably the biggest mistake that I tend to see after reviewing all of these for 2 years. I would say about 75% of the applications that we end up reviewing fall under the check all the boxes and are decent enough to go ahead and interview. And what that means is that they have this very common structure that I've listed on the PowerPoint slide. And then this common structure tackles all the big questions that we want to make sure that have been addressed, which is why dentistry? What are your motivations for going to dentistry? What makes you a good candidate for dental school? So they've tackled all of that. And then once you pair that with adequate hours and experiences, and you tackle that with decent letters of recommendation, then as a whole, they've checked all the boxes. And then the remaining 25% are either really bad or really good. And I'm gonna focus a little bit more on the really bad. The biggest thing is I highly encourage all applicants to have at least 1 to 2 people that they know, that know them and they trust to give them honest feedback, to read over their essay, and not for grammatical errors or spelling errors, but just for overall tone. And the reason why I stress this is because we are so focused on our personal statements. We've read it so many times. We've edited it so many times that we sort of read it in our own mindsets. So we think we're conveying this message because that's how we felt when we wrote it, but that's not necessarily what a third party would be picking up on. So it's very important for you to have someone else read it and then ask them at the end of it, what type of feeling do you get after reading this personal statement? Does it come off as genuine? Does it come off a little bit too aggressive or too strong? Because that does happen. And I don't necessarily think the applicant had meant for it to come off that way. It's just that maybe not enough people had read it, not enough of their close friends had read it to let them know that, hey, you're giving off this kind of a vibe. Because very often during the follow-up meeting, one person will be like, hey, did this applicant come off a little bit questionable? And everyone's like, yeah, like I got that feeling too. And that's not something that you want, okay? Letters of recommendation is another one, another big part of it, and probably one of the portions of the application that a lot of pre-dents struggle with. And I'm going to preface all of this by saying a bad letter of recommendation, at least from the committee perspective, is never held against you guys, the pre-dents, because we understand you have zero control over what the faculty decides to write about you. And I know that's often a concern that pre-dentals have, like, what if they write me a bad letter of recommendation? The times that we have seen bad letters of rec, and I'll give you examples of what those are, I think it would kind of surprise some of you. My apologies, I'm sorry, guys. What that means is faculty, actually the faculty sitting on the committee actually get a little bit heated when they see a bad letter of recommendation, because they're like, from the faculty standpoint, if you knew that you were way too swamped or you weren't able to write a good letter of recommendation, you should have done the student a favor and told them, hey, I don't think I'm a good fit to write this letter for you. You should have just done that solid for the student, so why didn't you? Unfortunately, that's not always the case, and the faculty will not always tell you that. Some do, which is great, good on them, but a lot don't. So it falls onto you as a student to really pick and choose the right faculty to write your letters of recommendation. So what that means is they have to at least try to get to know you. And I understand it's really hard to do. Some of these science classes are sometimes 300 to upwards of 600 students. You go to the office hours, which is what people tell you to do. You show up, there are 40 students there already, like you still don't get to know them. So how do you circumvent that? And one thing that I did when I was applying was I didn't really target the core sciences. So it's like your Gen Bios, Gen Chems, OChems. I didn't really consider faculty from those divisions. I looked at my upper div classes, like by my third year, fourth year. Those sciences, like the classes have dwindled quite a bit. So you have a better chance of getting to know the faculty one-on-one. There has never been a discussion during our committee reviews, reading letters of recommendation as to, oh my gosh, like this applicant had had a faculty member from kinesiology write their letter of recommendation, or earth sciences wrote their letter of recommendation. That's never really been an issue. Our main focus is whether or not this letter of recommendation gives us a good sense of who this is as a person. Because a good letter of recommendation can actually take an application very far. If we're on the fence about an applicant, or if, let's say, their personal statement sort of gives us iffy vibes, you come in with 3 or 4 good letters of rec, and where all of them are raving about you, we will always be like, oh, okay, so the personal statement was probably very edited. They probably didn't realize they were giving off this type of vibe. Like, these letter of recommendations clearly speak like very positively, like glowing reviews of the student. So let's just go ahead and interview them. And a good one can push you into the interview category. So ways that you can get faculty to know you: if the faculty gives you an opportunity to review exams one-on-one, definitely do that, because they have to do it one-on-one due to privacy concerns. If you sit in the front, they might not know your name, but they will always recognize your face. So if you pair that all together, it gives you a better opportunity of getting a letter writer that can speak to your values, speak to you as a person, and won't make mistakes such as insert name here, which has happened, or using different gender pronouns when they should be using, or different names. The whole thing is about medical school instead of dental school. Like, this all happens all the time. So that's why it's very important for you as an applicant to pick and choose your letter writers wisely. As far as the big do's and don'ts that I feel are most important to consider over the last 2 years, you guys have probably heard this time and time and again, which is apply as early as possible. I'll talk about that in detail on the last slide, which I actually think might be the next one. But definitely, as soon as you feel like your application is ready to go, please submit it ASAP, especially if UCLA is one of the schools that you're interested in. Explain weaknesses. We sort of talked about it a little bit earlier. If you feel like there's a portion of your application that is a little bit lackluster, like a lower GPA or a lower DAT score, there are other portions in the application that give you an opportunity to elaborate. So please maximize on using these portions, because we will read it. On the UCLA supplemental, there's an area where it's a free-for-all, like, is there anything else you want the admissions committee to consider? Or there's a disadvantaged section, or your gap year section. If you feel like there's something you need to explain, please explain it, because it gives us a way to fight for your case. If we don't have anything to back it up, then we can't say, we really like this applicant, please reconsider and let's interview them. Have others review your application, not just for grammatical and spelling errors, but just for overall tone, like we mentioned. Is your application painting a picture of you the way that you would like us to get to know you? Because all we have is this 30-page packet. So you definitely want to make sure that it's crafted in a way that presents yourself the way that you want to be presented. Letter writers, it's really good to give them a couple months heads up. For me, I think my application went out end of June, and I started contacting my letter writers end of March to see if they're willing to write me a strong letter of recommendation. Honesty about your hours, it's not something that we see very often, but it happens frequently enough that I think it's important to talk about. I think when we're crafting our applications, we're focusing our energy more so on other parts, like the personal statement and things like that. And thinking back over the couple of years and dates and hours, it seems a little bit daunting, so it's almost like an afterthought. But I can tell you, there are committee members that will sit there and spend the time to add up all the hours if they feel like something seems fishy, and they will bring it up at the next meeting and say, hey, if these hours are as this applicant says, then that means they didn't sleep at all. And that's a more extreme example, but that has happened. And there have been times that applicants have sort of messed up the hours. Granted, a lot of times it's an honest mistake, but I just encourage you to not put us in a position where we have to question whether or not you're ethical, whether or not you're lying about your hours, okay? So yeah, just try your best to make sure that your hours are correct. In terms of the biggest don't, it's really just the shadowing. Like, make sure that you do spend enough time shadowing a general practitioner. And it's okay if you want to shadow specialties. It's okay if you want to shadow like your family members, but make sure you get enough like GPs in there for sure. Okay, the last slide before we pretty much move on to the Q&A is why is it important to apply early? I know when I was applying, I kept hearing early, 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 like I had no idea what early even meant. I kept hearing rolling admissions, but I didn't know what rolling admissions means. So what that basically means is you have from June until about December to submit your application. You can submit your application at any point during that time frame. However, I think every single dental school in the nation now operates on rolling admissions. That means from the first instance that we start reviewing and interviewing students, we're starting to make acceptances. We're starting to fill up the class. Sometimes by November, a class can already be full. You can submit your application after that point. The school will receive it, but there's no guarantee whether or not your application is even going to get reviewed. Only because there are hundreds of applications that came before yours that have either been put on hold or waitlisted that still need to be looked at before yours is even considered. So in order to give yourself the biggest chance to get reviewed and considered for interview, it's really important for you to get that application in earlier. So my opinion of what early means is anywhere from June to about mid to late September. If you can get your application in within that time frame, I think you're good to go. Anything later than that, I think your chances, at least for UCLA, I think they're greatly diminished. So as far as like the content goes, we're pretty much done and we'll move on to the Q&A. So I wanted to thank you guys for joining us for the first part of this lecture series. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to participate. And I think dentistry is so great. I love it more now than I did when I was working at the dental office. I think you guys are gonna really, really enjoy it. I know this time period in your life is hard. It's easy for us where we are now to look back and be like, oh, you know, you guys are gonna be fine, like don't worry, like you're stressing out too much. But I remember when I was a pre-dent in your shoes, like I was stressing every single day. My anxiety was an all-time high. And especially with what you guys are dealing with right now with COVID-19, I know it's not easy. There's a lot of uncertainties, but know that like for us, we're also uncertain about our futures too. And ultimately, we're definitely here to help and support you. So after they give you guys the contact information, feel free to reach out to us at any point. We're here for you. And yeah, good luck.